Evening, everyone. As Leslie said, I'm Crystal Collins Judd, the president of Sarah Lawrence College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. This Justice Fellowship and Speaker Series is a year-long pilot program that flows from a major grant that Sarah Lawrence College received from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, a grant to convene and to connect with our surrounding communities. As part of that work, this series was created to bring together communities of young people in conversation, in engagement, and in action around the inequalities that are pervasive in our world. This year, the theme for this pilot collaboration focuses on equity and access in education. Participants in tonight's discussion include 25 people who were selected to participate in the Justice Fellowship. These are high school juniors and seniors from Yonkers, Mount Vernon, and Bronxville high schools, and Sarah Lawrence undergraduates and students from our Art of Teaching program. In addition, I'm delighted that tonight we are joined by parents, teachers, students, neighbors, and members of the Sarah Lawrence community at large. I would like to especially thank our partner school districts and their superintendents for helping us get this initiative off the ground. I also want to give a shout out to Sarah Lawrence's own Mara Gross, director of our community partnerships, who is the invisible presence behind helping hold all of this together tonight. We'll hear from 4 panel members. Collectively, their work draws from many years of experience in education. They will provide a perspective into the systemic inequities and opportunities within and outside of schools. We especially hope that this conversation tonight will help us engage together in longer conversations that not only identify the problems facing schools and education today, but as importantly, consider possible solutions. A little context for us as we begin. In the US today, there are more than 15,000 school districts, each often working independently of one another, each funded primarily by local property taxes, and each thus able to make vastly different resources and opportunities available to the students they serve. This is not a new issue, but it's one that we must examine, and tonight we will look into it more closely. I want to thank you for joining us. I know that we have a lively, provocative, informative evening ahead of us. And now it's my pleasure to hand off to our moderators for tonight, Bill Meyer from Bronxville High School and Kashana Soljour, who is Sarah Lawrence's very first Mellon Public Humanities Fellow. So Bill and Kashana, thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces tonight. And again, I just want to reiterate the thanks and appreciation we have for Sarah Lawrence and Yonkers Public Schools and Mount Vernon and Bronxville as well to help begin to build this foundation and this broader sense of community. And I think building on that piece and thinking about the focus of tonight and this lens of equity and access around education, it's also important to reiterate that idea of how hyper-localized education is. And we especially see that in New York and especially see that in Southern Westchester. So many times it's only by often going outside of our schools and re-envisioning what community means that we can start to address some of these great disparities that exist, address some of these growing concerns that exist, and start to make meaningful change within our schools and our communities. And that's really the intent and hope for tonight. Just to give you a quick overview before I pass it on to Kashana, we have 4 amazing speakers. We're going to introduce each one who will also give a short introduction into their own work, sort of speaking to the larger macro issues around education in Southern Westchester and New York City. And then the second part will include some Q&A questions or some questions from our Justice Fellows. And then we're going to open up to questions from the audience. And if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Kashana and I will be reading those questions and trying to direct them when appropriate to our speakers. So I think it should be a great night. The goal is to begin wrapping up a little past 8 o'clock and then so with all that said, thank you. And now I'll pass it over to Kashana, one of the Mellon Fellows.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's a pleasure for everyone to be with us tonight. We have four amazing panelists, and it's my honor to introduce Dr. Erickson, who is a U.S. historian who focuses on educational inequality, segregation, and the interactions between schooling, urban, and metropolitan space, racism, and capitalism. Dr. Erickson also co-directs the Harlem Education History Project with Ernest Morel, Coyle Professor of Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. HEHP supports a digital history project and collaborations with local schools to create classes in which young people explore the educational histories of their communities. The project produced an edited volume of new scholarship entitled Educating Harlem, A Century of Schooling and Resistance in a Black Community, published by Columbia University this year in 2020. So it is my honor to introduce Dr. Erickson.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And as my co-panelists know, I've been struggling with technology for the last few minutes, and President Judd appropriately said, this is one of the great examples of our inequality of this moment, right? I usually have stable Wi-Fi and devices that work, and right now I don't, and therefore everything feels a little unsettled. So I want you to know that in case something also goes a little unsettled. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. What I'm going to try to do is say a little bit about the kind of work I do, but also connect it to kind of work that I hope you might be interested in doing, because there are so many ways, and you'll hear this from people on the panel, to understand educational inequality and to figure out what your place is in learning it and trying to work on it. And so as a historian, it's going to be clear where I'm coming from, and you'll hear other perspectives from other folks. I'm going to share my screen. Nope, I'm not going to share my screen. Maybe Leslie will share the next slide. And you'll see a cover of the book that, that Kashana just so kindly described. And I want to show you this because it tells you a little bit about where I'm coming from. I just finished about a 6-year project working on understanding the history of education in Harlem as one part of the broader New York City story. And I will also note that the book is available freely online. If you'd like to access it, there's a link there. The free is important because one of the commitments of this work was to try to make sure that our scholarship and our learning was available to anybody who wanted to read it. So maybe we can we'll put that in the chat later. This book makes 2 big arguments, and they are arguments that are very much specific to Harlem's history as we understand it, but I think they matter for lots of places in the United States. So the first argument is that Harlem, as a smaller part of the bigger city of New York, never received the investment, the support that Black children in Harlem schools deserved. That was the true situation throughout the 20th century. And that is not unusual, but it's important to notice because if we only talk at the level of the city overall, we might miss the ways that parts of the city have been treated unequally. Another way to put this is to be thinking about how, so Harlem is a part of the bigger New York, but of course, Yonkers is a small part next to Bronxville, next to other districts, right? So the Harlem is in some ways helping us think about the ways that there can be very dramatically different experiences for children and families who live quite close to one another, but are finding schooling to unfold in very different ways. So that's the story about deep structural inequality. At the same time, though, this book argues that at no point in the 20th century were Black communities not fighting vigorously and through a variety of different mechanisms to secure the education that they deserved for their children. And that fighting happens through a tremendous array of kinds of work, from teaching to making schools to protesting to trying to challenge political leaders to invest as they should. And so just like deep inequality is part of the story of African-American education in the United States, so is profound and varied struggle. Would you shift to the next slide, please? Thank you. And I don't know Yonkers very well, but in a few minutes this morning, I thought, okay, I want to help illustrate what this point looks like when we think about Yonkers. This is an article actually from the Harlem-based New York Amsterdam News in 1968. And it illustrates that Yonkers also, like many neighborhoods throughout the United States, has its own tradition of educational protest, one that probably many of you are familiar with more than I am. But I thought this illustrates very well that there is in Yonkers, like many other places, a tradition of educational protest that current activists and others can engage with and learn from. If you look at item number 1 down on the left of your screen, the things that students are asking for resonate with a lot of the demands that students are making today in many places. I will read their words. This is the reprinting of a petition that they shared when they wanted to boycott their high school. 1, elimination of the racial prejudice that permeates the school system, elimination of the evaluation sheets used for pupil placement. That's got to do something about access to educational resources. Every teacher be required to take courses in Black history and Black problems, and on and on. And I love that the last one is 8 in caps, that teachers teach. I think that's powerful, not necessarily because of a criticism of what teachers are doing. It might have been that, but it's powerful because young people are saying what we want is the learning that we would like to have in school, right? This is young people saying, teach us. And in a moment when lots of public conversation about young people doesn't emphasize that deep desire for learning, seeing this underscored here, I think is really powerful. So the next slide, please. So part of what I've been trying to work on in my scholarship on the history of education in Harlem is the question of how to engage young people, high school students, in the study of the history of education and educational protest in their communities. And these are just 2 images from summer programs that I've helped run over the last few years. On the left, young people who go to one high school in Harlem, sitting together in a room with all kinds of historical documents about their high school, learning about its history. And on the right, young people leading a walking tour about the history of educational and other activism in Harlem. So I wanted to share these because I feel privileged to be a historian who gets to do this kind of work. But I also think that the kinds of stories that exist in communities, in Black communities, in Latinx communities around the US, stories of struggle and contention, are ones that can be, should be the terrain of learning for lots of people. So I look forward to hearing others' thoughts, and thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for the Wi-Fi for holding up for a moment.
Thank you so much. That was great, and great context for tonight's conversation. Our second speaker comes from a perspective which looks at early intervention, and Carol Robinson has worked in the field of early childhood education throughout Westchester and the Bronx her entire career. Her extensive experience ranged from being an early childhood teacher to the director of several early childhood programs. Carol is a member of the Child Care Council of Westchester, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and the Westchester Association for the Education of Young Children. So we're really excited to hear from Carol. Thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure and really an honor to be able to share with you my perspective. And in my own educational journey and what led to this work and the work I currently do. Now, the picture on the screen is a similar classroom in which I was educated in. I went to school in Jamaica, and this is what government funded education looks like on the island. And that was my classroom. Sadly enough, my daughter, who is also a Sarah Lawrence graduate, went back to Jamaica to teach, and it's the same classroom, looks just like this for low income. So this is what government funded look like. For private school and affluent areas, it looks very different. So just to put that into perspective. Okay, let me get to my next slide. Within that education system, and within that space, I didn't learn to read until I was 11 years old, although I went to school every single day. That type of setting just did not work for me as a child until a teacher decided to come out of the norm and what I now understand now to be a progressive approach. So coming from that background and entering the United States, which was very different, I also have a child. I came with a child and I was interested in navigating that system, that the inequalities looked the same that it was for me when I was a child. So I began navigating the system, and I started, one of the jobs I had was to work in a corporate setting, preschool, Bright Horizons, and realized quickly that the quality of the education in my neighborhood where I lived for young children in the Bronx was very different from what I was accustomed to in the neighborhood. So I started there. So I did learn a lot in that venture. I learned that early education was not the same for all children in the United States, and there was a difference now in early education, that there was family daycare, there was childcare, there was preschool, there was special needs preschool, there was UPK, and there was Head Start, and funding for these programs were very different, and the standards and the quality was different. So what I found that was very hard for me to take and brought my passion out in for education, early education, was just the vast difference between how young children were educated, and realizing that the opportunity that I was given by a progressive teacher was one that I would be able to do here in the United States if I understood how funding worked and what I needed to do to help young children. So in my current role, I work as an administrator overseeing Head Start program, UPK special education preschool. Now, Head Start is federally funded. UPK is funded by the school district, and the special needs preschool is funded through funds through the state coming from IDEA, the Disabilities Act. Now, access for those programs requires an eligibility system, and for Head Start, families must be below the poverty line, in foster care, or homeless. Now, when we talk about the poverty line, we're talking about, for a family of 4 in Westchester County, to qualify to be in Head Start, you're supposed to make approximately $26,000 annually, which leaves most children that are still in need of Head Start services out of eligibility. Now, for our childcare subsidy, families have to be working. Head Start, the families don't have to have a job. But for children, for childcare subsidy, families have to be working. And again, it leaves a group of children out of it because the eligibility rates take some children out. So one of the biggest dilemma is that what happens to the children that don't meet these eligibility criteria? They're usually ending up in family daycares, or not have access to an early education setting, or they're home with families. So although Head Start was created as a program that would level the playing field for children from disadvantaged communities, it proves that Head Start was not enough to give access to all children. that are in need of it. Now, early Head Start also came into being. Head Start is 0 to 5. Early Head Start is from 0. Early Head Start is 0 to 3. 3 to 5, sorry. Okay. So this is slides give just the brief rundown on the eligibility for Head Start. And how do we, in order for us to have any type of equity or education policy, we usually start out with advocacy. And then from our advocacy, it would lead us into getting the legislations and the policies. And when we get the implementation from the legislation and policies, regulation, we have to implement and enforce. Now, with the implementation, we often find that what we were intended when we advocated in the first place is not what we end up with. So then that's where we look at the implications and the outcome, and then we have to advocate again. One thing that is very important to remember is that we don't get any type of social change without the advocacy and the work of the community. Parents are really the power players in the game, and so we have to constantly do more to bring parents into the budget hearing and to give them a sense of an understanding how funding work and how do we get access for children. Elected officials understand two things, the importance of two things. They understand votes and they understand large numbers, and they understand who is going to give them the donation, where is funding going to come from for their campaign and to keep their jobs. And so as we continue to push for access, and the picture you're seeing on the screen was one picture when I worked for Grayson in Yonkers, where we have a lot of issues with getting access to early childhood. And I took a group of parents to the Westchester County budget hearing and have them speak for what they need, and also taking the children to those hearings sometimes help. But funding is important, and funding for early education for low-income children, we have to get that through our public officials. Now, in the private setting in which I started working when I first entered the field of early childhood in New York is parent funding. And so the parents who have access to early education by way of a $20,000 a year tuition, they are able to have it. But for our children, we have to have early education funding. And you know, in my work, the funding streams are so different. And one of the challenges to get the stakeholders together. So you have funding coming from the state, funding coming through Head Start, and it's often very difficult because it's so fragmented, because early education is not a uniform funded and there's so much competition between stakeholders. So that's pretty much what I would like to share. It could be a longer discussion, and it was very hard for me to cut down all that I could say. I didn't go too much in the history. I can share you resources on the history of Head Start and the timeline, and also for our special needs program. But I'm open to questions, and thank you very much for having me share.
Thank you so much, Carol. I think definitely some of the things that you weren't able to discuss, I think will definitely come up in the question and answer period, because I think there's a lot of points, especially about funding and stakeholders, that a lot of our panelists would be really interested in further discussion. At this point, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Bell. She received her doctorate from the Cultural Foundations of Education program at Syracuse University. Her scholarship centers Black women's embodied pedagogies, family, school, community partnerships, and qualitative research methods. For her dissertation research, Camilla sought to understand In more nuanced ways, Black women's activation of their own lived experiences to both disrupt systems of oppression and realize education as the practice of freedom for Black youth within and beyond school context. Operating in the tradition of Black women pedagogies, Camilla remains committed to constructing spaces and places of learning where students actively participate in the learning process and are equipped with the tools to become agents of change. Thank you so much for joining us, Camilla.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. All right, we're gonna get right into it. So just to give you a little context for the slides that I'm gonna be sharing with you all, as a public humanities fellow, I organized a 2-day retreat with former facilitators of the 2018 Summer Arts and Culture Camp. It took place at the Community Folk Art Center in Syracuse, New York. And it was at this retreat where we decided that we wanted to measure the impact of that program on the youth that participated, as well as get a better sense of what the parents experienced having their kids participate in this camp. And so it was modeled after the freedom schools of the civil rights movement, and the objective, or I should say the purpose of providing this programming was to enable creatives in grades 5 to 8 to really grapple with the questions, I should say, of what does freedom look like and what does freedom feel like in my city? And so for the purposes of this presentation, I want to just introduce you to some of the youth that I had the privilege of working with during that time and paint a larger picture of the possibilities engendered when education for liberation is at the crux of our teaching philosophies, curriculum, community engagement, and practice. And so I want you to meet Lamia, the storyteller. On the second day, when we met to dialogue about the impact of the 2018 Summer Arts and Culture Camp, we asked everyone present the following question: what have you learned about yourself from participating in summer camp? And to this question, Marina, with a newfound confidence, stated, I figured out that I'm an artist. Here we have Amaya, the peaceful leader. Same question. Amaya's response, that meeting people can be the best experience you could ever have. Here we have Tavion, who wants to be a cartographer when he gets older. While stroking his little chin and pondering the question for a good minute, everyone squirming, awaiting his response, after what felt like an eternity, he smoothly said that I can make poems. And to this, everyone snapped to affirm his statement. And he went on to add, because I don't do that a lot. Here we have Malik, the thoughtful one. And when asked, what is your definition of creativity? Do you see yourself as more creative after summer camp? This is what he said. I think creativity is something that you can turn to, like someone that you can turn to when, and this is when where a former facilitator interjected and said like an outlet. And he said, yeah, like an outlet. I want to introduce you to Jahara, the creative spark. And same question, Jahara responded with this. I think creativity is like when a person has their own world in their own mind where they can express in a different way through either it's making stuff or drawing different types of things or making creative poems, like different types of ways of showing it. And I think that summer camp was a really good way of showing that, whether it's the cups, the forks, I can make my creativity and put it in. And with everyone here has a different personality, and I can turn that and make it into my invention. So we move on to Adriana, the quiet storm. Unsure of how to express her thoughts, but committed to trying all the same, she declares, I think this camp made me more creative because it made me more open-minded. I just was not open to very many options. And so as we move forward, all of the responses shared are in conversation with that of Lynette Y., who in 1964 wrote a letter to Governor Johnson, then Governor Johnson, in the Freedom Press publication of the Mount Zion Freedom School in Mississippi. And Lynette says this as her stating her reasons or outlining her reasons as to why she is even participating in the Mount Zion Freedom School. And I'm just going to read a snippet for you here. She says this: I want to learn about my race. I want to become a part of history. I want to have the opportunity to learn what I cannot learn in regular school. I want to be able to vote when I am 21, and I want to be a first-class citizen. In Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, she says the following: to educate as the practice of freedom is a way of teaching that anyone can learn. That learning process comes easiest to those of us who teach, who also believe that there is an aspect of our vocation that is sacred, who believe that our work is not merely to share information, but to share in the intellectual and spiritual growth of our students. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and most intimately begin. What you'll notice in this particular excerpt is that there are no limitations placed on the teaching and learning process. Instead, it's not confined to school context either, but rather it's grounded in the idea that learning can happen anywhere, and that creating change agents has been an ongoing process and struggle, and that it still continues. So there is work to be done still. Thank you so much. And I look forward to the conversation that will follow.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. That was really well said, and a lot of that, the historical piece resonates so much with what's happening today. It's my pleasure to introduce our last panelist, Marina Marco O'Malley, who is the Operations and Policy Director for the Alliance for Quality Education. Marina joined AQE in late May 2008. As a former preschool and elementary school teacher, as well as an adjunct lecturer at the University of Albany, she has seen how education policy affects students' lives and future. Her expertise is in fiscal analysis of education and state budgets for pre-K through 12 and education policy, particularly in regards to educational equity for Black, Brown, and low-income communities, as well as in the state's insufficient investment in early care and learning. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Marina.
Good evening, everyone. Let me share my screen. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you tonight. And I am really excited to actually be going last, because AQE really combines a lot of all of the other speakers have mentioned. We are a coalition of community organizing groups that mobilize parents, students, teachers across the state. And even though we originally were created 20 years ago to give voice to a lawsuit, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, that originated from Manhattan, from a group of Black parents. Actually, the lead plaintiff is now Senator Robert Jackson from Manhattan, who sued the state because of inadequate, inefficient state funding for the schools that were primarily educating Black and Brown students in the city. And even though we were created in that, we actually have evolved, and our mission is that we need public funding. We need adequate public funding, not just for the sake of funding, but because it is with money that we can have adequate resources in schools, teachers, technology, buildings that are actually functioning and meet students' needs, curricula that are culturally responsive, alternatives to suspensions that are based in restorative practice, fully funded pre-K programs, and early education access for infants and toddlers that actually will build the continuum of education so that every child is successful. So I'm really delighted that I'm going last here because it's a combination of everything that has been said. These are just some of the groups that actually comprise AQE to varying degrees of involvement. We are statewide, and how we are an advocacy organization. So how we influence the powers that be in Albany, the decision makers. We actually do it through several different ways. One of them is by having strong presence in media. We have we try to create a narrative that actually permeates, but it's through students and teachers and school stories that happens. So these are some of the headlines from across the state. We do that. We give the facts and data through our reports. The numbers by themselves don't really matter that much, but the stories that those numbers connect to really paint the picture. These are some of our reports from last year. We have done a few more this year, but I would say that one of our most powerful reports, the view from the classroom, was one that we did when we toured several schools across the state. And we saw in practice how students' lived experience within the school building was. And educational racism is something that we have talked about forever. I've been here for 12 years in my organization, and this is something that we are deeply committed to dismantling. And recently, we have been incredibly more explicit in calling out those who perpetuate educational racism, and because policy decisions reflect our priorities and perpetuate certain things that we do not want to see. I'm going backwards here. Advocacy through the courts. I mentioned the lawsuit that gave rise to AQE. What I didn't say is that the lawsuit was filed in 1993. AQE was created in 2000. The final ruling for this lawsuit was rendered in 2006. Here in 2020, we are still fighting for the outcomes of that lawsuit to be fully implemented. And I will tell you that the primary recipients of this structural, this unwillingness of the state to meet this lawsuit ruling from the Court of Appeals, the state's highest court, is deeply rooted in educational racism, and it affects Black and Brown students in low-income communities like Yonkers, communities like New York City, like Buffalo, like Rochester, Syracuse, and Albany, and Brentwood on Long Island. Sometimes we think of Long Island as a place where there's great wealth. There's also great poverty and great segregation and great inequities. So alone, just the lawsuit wouldn't bring us to the equity that we wanted to have, to the equity and adequacy that needed to exist. And lastly, through developing parent leaders. What we do is we have conversations with people one-on-ones. We help them understand their own power and help them become spokespeople for their communities, help them learn how to talk to legislators, both local legislators on school boards, city councils, and state legislators that make decisions at the state level. So it is all levels of decision making here. These are just some of our events we have done in Albany and New York City and in various communities in Buffalo. And ultimately, we do all of this work because we want to influence the power structure of our state and help the leaders prioritize the right things and deliver for our students. So there are 3 influent decision makers in the state. the state Senate, the state assembly, and the executive, that's the governor. In New York, we are a triple D state. The governor is a Democrat, the majority leader, our first a Black woman majority leader in the state Senate, and the state assembly, our first Black speaker of the state assembly, are all those who decide the state budget and how these resources are divvied up across the state in the various sectors of the economy and of what the state funds. You would think that, you know, since all these people are the same party, that they would agree on the same things, but they do not. They vary a great deal in their values and beliefs and what they're willing to do to actually move the equity agenda forward. So what we urge all of you to do, and I wish I could see all of you because I wanted to ask a question of those of you who turned 18 before the election, how many were registered to vote and how many did vote? Because that is ultimately the power you have to change things. And if this last election didn't teach us that, I don't know what else will actually teach us that. That is the very first thing that I would urge you to do. If you have turned 18, go register to vote. If you're turning 18, the moment you have your birthday, go register to vote. Don't let other people decide. Make your decisions. Be involved. And the other ways that you can be involved actually is, get involved in an organization like ours. There are plenty across the state. You can join us in any fight that has to do with education for liberation and dismantling educational racism and adequacy, having adequacy in our schools. I will drop in the chat just stop the share here. I will drop in the chat 2 actions that you can take today, and you do not have to be a registered voter to do that. You didn't even have to take anything else, any other action in your life. You just can click and send an email to our elected representatives. I will put it in the chat as we are talking, but I wanted to say that this last year has taught us a great deal. Not only that we can make change with the most recent election, but that we can also change the way we think about and act and become involved. I have been working from home since March 13th. Our advocacy and our work hasn't stopped. We have engaged about 30,000 more people across the state through digital access, through the internet. More people have tweeted, more people have made social media posts, more people have taken email actions. That's how we've moved all of our lobbying, all of our advocacy, bringing parents to the state capitol. We moved them all to online rallies where we have had thousands of people actually lobby their representatives and give them their story so that we can have change in our budget, in our state. So there are multiple ways that you can get engaged. There are multiple ways that you can affect change. And even in these really difficult times, you can do it from your home. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marina. And I really think all 4 of the panelists spoke so well to the fact that these are concerns of equity and access that aren't about the past. It's not about another part of the country. This is really centered where we live. In fact, I think today schools are more segregated than they were in 1954 at the time of the Brown ruling, and the most segregated schools in the country are here in New York. And with that segregation comes huge disparities in funding, as we ourselves know and see visibly here in Westchester in the metropolitan area. So I'm now going to ask our first Justice Fellow, Annika, to read or ask a first question, which I think speaks well to these larger issues of funding and equity. So if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, so One thing we were wondering was if education funding were to be equalized, how long would it take poorer communities to, for lack of a more formal phrase, catch up to wealthy communities that have historically had access to more resources and funding?
Marina, or would you like
Yeah.
to start with that?
So typically change in our education system takes at minimum 3 to 5 years, which is why we actually need I didn't say this, but the lawsuit, the result of the lawsuit and the legislative solution that addressed all of the state and not just New York City, was that brought about a large infusion of funding so that school districts who are underfunded would catch up within 4 years of that funding. Now that didn't happen. We are still very much behind. We had a recession, priorities changed, other interests prevailed, but you need a large infusion of resources, funding and other resources, not just funding, and within about 5 years you begin to see the results, but it takes time. It takes time to actually change things around.
Okay, the inequality starts in infancy. So with a lack of funding for early education, starting with infants, starting with prenatal, when we look at the inequities and brain development and how children learn and develop, that infancy stage is really crucial. So for us to catch up, we really have to start with infancy, because if we're waiting to elementary school to put funding in to catch up, we have already missed the mark. So we really need to start at a very early age. So it's gonna take time, but the real deal is really with starting with infancy. Infant care is important, and support for pregnant moms.
I agree with both of Marina and Carol's points about needing to think for a long term. I also, though, just want to say something that comes from thinking about the long historical term, which is that when this country has wanted to invest intensively in something, it has done so, and it has done so quickly. So we also need to understand that this isn't a matter of the impossibility of acting quickly. It's a problem of will to do so.
If I may add one thing, we like to say that budgets are about priorities. And if we do not prioritize our youngest, as Carol said, New Yorkers, that will save us in the long term so much more funding, other resources in special education. There's so many, everybody agrees universally that early education actually brings about the best results. And yet we choose to invest the smallest amount of funding, smallest resources in our early education system. So it's about priorities. And while we cannot ignore the students who are already in the K-12 system, we got to do both. And in a country that is the richest in the world, and in a state that is among the richest in the nation, that is about choices, not about lack of resources.
I would just add that while it's so very important to look further down ahead in the future and to prepare for that, it's so important to think about what's happening in the now and what we can do in the now to ensure that in 2064, there's not a parallel between a student who is going to school at that point and Lynette in 1964, again, as I showed in my presentation, between Lynette and some of the students that were participating in the Creative Arts Academy Summer Arts and Culture Camp. And so I think that throughout the different presentations tonight, that there were some action items that can be thought about as we think about, okay, how can we ensure that we are providing opportunities and resources for communities that are suffering to actually have the opportunities that other school districts or students have access to already. Um, and one of the things, or some of the things that I heard that I think would be helpful in thinking about how we can address some of those issues now in preparation for a more just future, um, engaging the community. Um, Marina talked about advocacy. She talked about agency. She talked about a knowledge of the budget and how funding and how money works. And I think that's so very important. And so I think when we have this consciousness about how it works, we can feel more empowered to make those decisions and to hold the people accountable who are literally at the table to say, hey, we are invested in this. We understand that this is the issue and we want you to fight for these things. And so I think that your question is such a big one. And yes, the educational system is one of the slowest systems to change, but I think we can begin thinking now, how can we think about this issue now in a way that prepares us and sets us up for future success? Success in the sense that that gap when it comes to funding and that gap when it comes to resources and opportunities, it's minimized.
Thank you so much for your response, Dr. Bell. Believe it or not, our next question comes from one of our Justice Fellows, John, who's actually going to broaden the conversation a little bit more to talk about more of the sort of nitty-gritty details of what you're actually talking about as far as redistribution of resources.
Hello. Me and my fellow peers are wondering about how we can shift the focus from integration to equity and redistribution of the wealth and resources.
So, John, thank you for that really important question. I think I want to think about some people that I've gotten to learn about in working on the history of education in Harlem as examples of how what can feel like a separated conversation has actually in some ways been the same conversation. So May Mallory is a woman who was a parent in Harlem in junior high schools and elementary schools in the late 1950s. She was furious about the quality of education that she felt she saw her children receiving. And she organized both through to sue the school system and organized with other parents to create a boycott of junior high schools to comment on the segregation and inequality she saw. So she was an activist against segregation, but she was also doing so explicitly because she felt like what she was doing was making a claim on the resources her children deserved. And she was recognizing the historic pattern in this country of putting resources in the hands of white people and white communities and white institutions, and thought of desegregation as a strategy to achieve those resources. So I value your question because I think it feels like sometimes, especially in education, people want to say, well, we're going to choose one thing or we're going to choose another thing. But when we look at the stories of these women who are frustrated at the state of education for their own children and their whole communities, they actually had a multi-part analysis. And so May Mallory was not standing up saying, I think my child can only learn if he or she has white classmates. She wasn't interested in that argument at all. What she was interested in was saying, we have a historic pattern here, and the way we're going to challenge it is by having kids connected to one another in schools. That may not be your preferred route, right? But I really appreciate the way she and others had a strategic reason for thinking about desegregation, which wasn't replicating some of the racist messaging that was around about desegregation, right? That somehow Black children needed the presence of white children. Instead, she was saying, we need the resources. And she and other people were saying, and we need decision-making power in these schools as well. So these agendas were all mixed up in a way that is important for us to pay attention to, even though it might not lead us to one single approach right now. So I really appreciate your question.
I'd like to also, I think our next question, Maeve Sullivan, actually builds on that really nicely. So Maeve, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, I'm Maeve. And the third question that we had proposed was, how can we facilitate issues of equity while at the same time validating equity to not be at the expense of another student?
Dr. Bell, would you like to respond to that?
If I could ask just for elaboration on that question, or could you talk a little bit more about how you're thinking of this question so I can be better inclined to respond?
I think you're still muted, Maeve.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Basically saying how it would be in order to achieve equity, I guess you could think of it in terms of an economic standpoint, and that how to the concern is that in order to bring one community up, say a lesser or poorer community, the concern from the wealthier community would be that you're taking from them. And so the question kind of points to how do you validate both perspectives and work with both parties to achieve a medium ground.
Dr. Bell wants a few minutes to think about this.
Okay.
I can give you an example right here. So you guys are all in Westchester, right? You are the home of Yonkers Public Schools and Scarsdale Public Schools, right? So one would think that, a wealthy community like Scarsdale, and Yonkers, who is a community that is mostly low-income students in the school district, that we would say, let's take from Scarsdale to give to Yonkers, but that's not the case. We've always said that look at Scarsdale Public Schools. It's some of the best schools, not in this country, but in the world. That is the standard that we need to hold our education and bring and actually give adequate resources to everyone else to reach that. So it's not a choice of parents who can move from one school district to another to make that move. And to the previous question, right? I don't know how many of you actually heard listened to the podcast, Nice White Parents from the city. So, and Dr. Erickson made this point. Integration and was not, or at least as far as I know as well, was not about bringing Black and brown and white students together so they can learn better. It was about all those resources. It was about actually, when they have schools that have white students in them, actually the funding follows them. That is how our decision makers are actually conditioned to think about things, and without even recognizing it. So it's about the resources. It's not about anything else. And there have been schools that have been all Black that are, when they're adequately resourced, that are incredibly beautiful places to be. My executive director, Jasmine Gripper, says that she went to school, to Wakanda style school, because it was adequately resourced. All of her teachers were Black. Most of her fellow students were Black, and it was a beautiful place to be in, where she learned, and she felt she was able to achieve so much. Her, being able to see herself in other people and the adults in the school. So it's about those resources and how when we compare stories, and we have stories of students and parents from wealthy communities actually speaking up and saying, this is the experience we have here, and students and parents and teachers from communities who are struggling, low-income communities with a lot of poverty, and saying, we don't have that. We have to struggle for the most basic things. Well, that's not an argument to rob Paul and give to Peter. It's about actually raising money from everyone and giving to those who need it first.
Okay, I think also it's a structural issue of how funding for education is, how it's funded through property taxes. And because we live in economically segregated communities and also racially segregated communities, it is very difficult if we're relying solely on property taxes to fund the schools. So this is where we have to look at the structural issue of how we fund it. By design, some schools are going to be under-resourced just because of who lives in the neighborhood and the property taxes that communities are able to afford. I know there are some communities that their property taxes is more than the annual salary of my early childhood teachers. So for teachers coming from that community for their children without adequate funding from other sources to facilitate the school in their communities, it's very hard to see where the equity is going to come from.
Great. In the interest of time, we're going to shift to our fourth question from one of our fellows who actually is going to sort of, I think, bring us together a little bit more by thinking about sort of past policy, but also what we can do in the future.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael, and my question to the panel is, how can we use the failures of past policies to shape how we address these issues in the future? And how have policies such as No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top worked to perpetuate these disparities rather than fix them?
Thank you so much for your question. For the other two questions, I'm going to try to tackle them with the question that Michael just posed. And so I think some of the thoughts that I have so far. Who is most impacted by these policies? I think that these are some critical questions that we have to begin at. Well, we have to continually ask. The competition that is fostered through policies such as Race to the Top, such as No Child Left Behind. I was still in elementary school when No Child Left Behind came about, and I know plenty of my peers who were left behind, right? And so I think the question is, who is impacted by these policies, and how do these policies shape, or I want to say hinder, the academic trajectories of students who are already struggling in schools that do not need a policy that says, if you do well, then you will get funding. We're already struggling. So how is that going to, what is the incentive now for us to do well when we're already struggling and need that support? It's very counterintuitive and contradictory. So I think, how the questions that we ask need to change. And then I think the question that, going back to basics, question that we always need to ask is, what is the purpose of education? Because with this competitive nature of No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, the purpose is the purpose, which we know that's not necessarily the case, right? Is the purpose of education to ensure that students have access, that there are equitable opportunities to learn in an environment that is safe, that is welcoming, that is empowering? If that is the case, then these policies are not helpful. They are actually detrimental to students in communities who are struggling academically for a number of reasons, be it the structural issues that Carol spoke of earlier, or the issues that are at like more federal levels. And so I think that to the points that John and Maeve were making, and to the question that Michael is posing, I think we need to really begin thinking about how these policies are shaped, who is at the table shaping them, and how we can begin to really empower communities that are most impacted by these policies to hold those sitting at the table accountable for these laws that are put in place that are very detrimental to the academic trajectories and success of students.
Really well said. Thank you. I want to make sure we have a chance for our final question. And as this is unfolding, I'm realizing that an hour and 15 minutes is grossly inadequate for this conversation and all the points we've touched on. So this will be the last opportunity as well for each of the panelists to make any final points that they'd also like to bring up after this question. So Rosabelle, if you'd like to ask it.
Hello, my name is Rosabelle, and the question that my peers and I came up with is, how can schools address inherent privilege that some students possess?
So for me, there's a connection between your question and Maeve's, which is that historically, the way that the US has talked about segregation and inequality in education is to talk about the real harms and the real sort of disinvestment that communities of color and especially African American communities have faced. That is a true story. The other side of the story, though, is what happens when children with a lot of privilege then get to go to school surrounded by other children with a lot of privilege, and their education is shaped by the limits of that experience. That the philosopher Charles Mills talks about a sort of a claim of white racial ignorance. We could think of it as a kind of miseducation if we want to use the terminology to modify the terminology that Carter G. Woodson used to characterize education that actually gets in the way of people's learning. And so part of this conversation has to be not only what's necessary to intervene in the historic racism against communities of color, but to figure out ways that education acts to better educate white and privileged students. So I think that one of the ways that schools can intervene in the privileges that some children bring is to make sure that they're not the only kind of kid in the classroom. So that is speaking in favor of desegregation. But I have to say that carefully, because it's also true that our country's history of desegregation has had its own kinds of violences and inequalities within it. So that's in some ways another conversation. But for me, the reframing, who's losing in segregated systems? I think everybody loses in segregated systems. It affects the knowledge that everyone has, and we need to think about all of us having a stake in undoing them.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to make a final point?
Yeah, I actually, in response to this particular question, I think that state policymakers, not just legislators, but also the state education department and the state board of regents who decide education policy for the state, can actually take a stance and push with some real power behind culturally responsive education, culturally responsive sustaining education. And I don't just mean, having Black History Month, for instance. I mean, actually incorporating different cultures in the curriculum of the day. I mean, having anti-racist education all the way for teachers, students, and parents. And speaking up and speaking out and calling out the privilege when we see it, starting with ourselves. That is definitely something that we can all do in whatever capacity we have, from our own little units to the larger unit of our community.
Thank you. Carol, would you like to respond?
To bring meaningful education, especially at a young age and with families, but also as educators, not to approach families and education from a colonizer's perspective, because we also have a lot to learn from our privilege, but also families have a lot to offer. They can teach us. And as we bring children together, we're not operating from that perspective that I'm here to save you, because families of color, they know what they want for their children, and they have knowledge also to share. And just to assume, like, I'll just share, someone had a conversation with me, and we're in technology now, and someone said to me, well, the parents are not capable of using the technology to do the seesaw. And my question was, did you show them? We have to teach them. How do we know they're not capable? But from a colonizer perspective, we start from a place that we need to save them because they don't know any better. So let's run in and fix it. And that approach makes it worse, not better. We shut people down. So I think that's one way for us to approach it, is to be open to learn and understand the needs of the community, their history, their fears, their challenges, and their successes that they can share with us.
Thank you. Dr. Bell?
I would just add that curriculum is political. The decisions that we make when we're constructing curriculum, when we're constructing syllabi, as professors know, it's a very political act. It's very politicized, and so creating opportunities in literature, they have this concept where it's mirrors and windows. You want to provide mirrors so that students can see themselves, and you also want to provide windows so that they can also have access to other ways of being and knowing and navigating the world. And so providing those mirrors and windows are so essential. It's not just for students of color, it's for all students so that they can see themselves in the curriculum and not just feel othered and marginalized by the decisions that we can actively make as educators, to ensure that they have a place in what they are learning. And I think also it's a racial responsibility that we can all have to ensure that spaces of learning are literally constructed in such a way where what we select to read, what we select to engage with, it reflects the lived experiences and realities of the students in the classroom space or in that particular place of learning. So I think that is very important, ensuring that there are mirrors and windows and that there is a space to dialogue. And it's not always going to be a safe space. It can be a space that is uncomfortable, but I think it is in that discomfort where we can get to that learning edge and really have authentic and real conversations about how to enact that lasting change that we're calling for, even in tonight's conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell, for sort of bringing this conversation to, unfortunately, a close in the interest of time. But I did want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and for really raising some really important points, but also giving our audience members points of entry, right, to engage in their own communities, to continue the conversations that have begun tonight. I think our work is really still in the beginning stages. And I think one of the great things about this panel is really allowing us to reflect on our own experiences, but how we can actually enter into our own communities and work with our students, work with our administration, work with our policymakers, right, to really push the lever towards equity. So I do want to thank you all for your time. And most importantly, I do want to plug something really quickly. Our next panel will be in March, so we have a little bit of break, but our next panel will be an exploration of the lived experiences of educators and students in Southern Westchester. So we do hope that you join us again in a couple months, and want to thank you again. And just a quick reminder for our fellows, even after this particular meeting ends, we'd like to invite you back on for a debriefing session. So you're going to log off and log back on for us to sort of talk about this panel. But on behalf of all of us, and I'm sure Bill wanted to say a word or two, thank you for joining us, and we hope for more fruitful conversations in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a powerful night and evening, and so much to take in and process. So we really look forward to building from this. But thank you to each of the panelists for your insight, your wisdom, and your passion for education and students and change. So everyone have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, be well. And if the Justice Fellows could log off and log back on, that'd be great. So take care.
Thank you.